He sat alone in the cold barracks of Camp 115, a pencil trembling between his fingers. The wind clawed through cracks in the wooden walls, carrying the smell of coal smoke and damp straw. Every breath turned to mist. "You promised me peace." The words scraped across the thin paper like a wound reopening. He pressed harder, the graphite breaking mid-sentence. Outside, snow whispered against the wire fence, the same wire that once caged the men he had called enemies. Now, he was the prisoner. The others were asleep, curled under coarse blankets that smelled of mud and fear. But he couldn't sleep. Not tonight. Not after what he'd heard. Tomorrow, the trucks were leaving, taking men east toward the Soviet zone. For many, that meant disappearance. So he wrote faster, desperate to finish before the guards made their rounds. He wrote to a woman he was never meant to know. A British nurse. The enemy. The one who had saved him. The candle guttered. He signed his name, Wilhelm Krauss, folded the page, sealed it, and slipped it under the loose board by his cot. He never knew the letter would vanish. Never knew it would be found 42 years later. Its ink faded, but its words still bleeding with something forbidden, mercy. Because hidden inside that letter was a question that history still refuses to answer. Can compassion survive a war built on cruelty? It was the kind of discovery that shouldn't have been possible. In the winter of 1989, a British historian named Edward Hargreaves was cataloging a dusty box of unclaimed wartime correspondence in a forgotten records room in Yorkshire. The air smelled of mildew and old ink. Most letters were routine. Soldiers writing home, families pleading for news, bureaucratic forms that had lost their destination decades ago. But one envelope stood out. Its edges were browned, its seal unbroken. Across it, in precise German handwriting, were two words that caught his eye. Zurich, unser Stelber. Return to sender. The date stamp read March 1947. The sender's name, Wilhelm Krauss, POW 4872. The intended recipient, Margaret Ellis, Red Cross volunteer, Lincolnshire. Hargreaves turned it over in his hand, confused. German POWs had long been released by then. And even if this one hadn't, why would a German prisoner be writing to a British nurse? 2 years after the war had ended? The temptation was too much. He sliced the envelope open with a trembling hand. Inside lay 3 thin sheets of fragile paper, written in careful, almost schoolteacher-like cursive. The opening line read, "You promised me peace, and I believed you." Hargreaves froze. He knew instantly that this was no military report, no administrative form. This was a man's confession, and perhaps his farewell. The deeper he read, the stranger it became. The writer spoke of a woman who had brought medicine and light in a place built for shame. He described a snowstorm, a locket, a whispered promise. And then, suddenly, the writing stopped mid-sentence. The last word trailed off, "I hope you." Nothing more. No closing, no farewell. Just silence, like a voice cut off mid-breath. Hargreaves leaned back, stunned. Why was the letter never delivered? Who was this nurse? And why did a German soldier, of all people, speak of her as though she were his salvation? He checked the record books. Wilhelm Krauss appeared on the roll of Camp 115, a POW facility near Market Weighton in northern England, one of Britain's largest. But after 1947, his name simply vanished. No transfer, no release record, no death notice. That was impossible. The British military didn't lose track of prisoners, unless they wanted to. And so, like any good historian, or perhaps like a man chasing a ghost, Hargreaves drove out to the old camp grounds the next day. The place was gone, swallowed by farmland and frost. Only a few rusted fence posts remained, half buried in the mud. As the wind howled across the empty field, he imagined what it must have looked like in 1945, thousands of men. Behind wire, their futures sealed, their guilt unspoken. He looked at the letter again. Why had this one survived when so many others had vanished? Was it a love story? A betrayal? A secret buried by the state? The last line of the second page seemed to whisper an answer. If this letter is ever found, know that I tried to keep my promise, But peace is not given. It is earned. A promise. A confession. A mystery. And so began the search that would lead not only to the truth about Wilhelm Krauss and Margaret Ellis, but to something far more disturbing. The hidden chapter of Britain's forgotten prisoners and the woman who dared to see them as human. Britain, 1945. The war was over, but peace hadn't arrived yet. The skies were quiet, but the fields whispered with the ghosts of what had been. Across the countryside, from Kent to Yorkshire, rows of barbed wire still scarred the green. Behind them stood almost 400,000 German prisoners, silent figures in worn gray uniforms. Locals called them the enemy. To the government, they were assets. To themselves, they were no one. Camp 115 near Market Weydon looked like any other. Guard towers made from timber, long huts smelling of damp straw and boiled cabbage, a low fog that never seemed to lift. But among those forgotten men was Sergeant Wilhelm Krauss, once a schoolteacher from Hamburg, now reduced to a number stitched into his jacket. He wasn't violent. He wasn't a fanatic. He was simply tired. Tired of orders, tired of guilt, tired of hearing the word Heil echo through memory. In his pocket, he still carried a folded page torn from a child's notebook, a drawing his students had made before the war. He looked at it sometimes to remember who he had been before the uniform. Life in the camp was a quiet punishment. Men woke before dawn to the clang of metal cups, worked the fields, or chopped timber under the eyes of British guards who were mostly young, kind, and weary of war themselves. Meals were thin stew and dry bread. Nights were colder than memory allowed. But something unusual was happening in Britain's camps, something the world didn't expect. Unlike in the Soviet zones, the British had chosen a different path. They fed their prisoners properly, allowed them to work for pay, even gave them access to libraries and church services. It wasn't kindness born of guilt. It was strategy. The goal was re-education. Turn soldiers into men again. At first, Wilhelm thought it was propaganda. He'd seen plenty of that before. But slowly, he noticed small acts that didn't fit the logic of hatred. A guard handing over an extra biscuit. A farmer thanking a prisoner for fixing his fence. British children waving at men behind barbed wire. And then, one day she arrived. Margaret Ellis, a Red Cross nurse with chestnut hair pinned under her cap, and a notebook tucked against her chest. She walked with purpose, but looked like she carried something heavy, something personal. She was there for a health inspection, to check malnutrition levels among the prisoners. When she stepped into the infirmary, the room went silent. Even the prisoners seemed afraid to breathe. But she didn't flinch. She greeted them not as enemy combatants, but as patients. When she reached Wilhelm's bunk, she paused. His hands were trembling from frostbite. She looked at them for a long moment before saying softly, "A teacher's hands shouldn't freeze." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He had forgotten what gentleness sounded like. Over the next weeks, she returned often, sometimes to deliver medicine, sometimes food, sometimes just silence that felt warmer than words. The guards didn't question it. Not yet. Wilhelm began to write again, small notes on scrap paper, words he hadn't used since the war began. Thank you, trust, peace. It wasn't love. Not then. It was something deeper. The fragile, impossible recognition of humanity between two people who were never supposed to see each other as human. But war doesn't end when the guns go. Silent. It hides in the hearts of those left behind. And someone was watching. Late one evening, a guard noticed how long Margaret lingered near the infirmary door. A few others whispered. Rules were rules. Compassion had limits. Still, when she left the camp that night, Wilhelm risked a glance through the frost on the window. She turned once, as if she knew. In that instant, he realized the world outside might have moved on from war. But for him, and for her, it had only just begun. The snow came early that winter. Thick, silent, endless. It buried the camp in a white stillness that made every sound, every cough, every footstep, echo like a confession. For the prisoners of Camp 115, it was another reminder that time was moving on without them. For Wilhelm Krauss, it became the season when everything changed. Margaret kept returning, even when she wasn't scheduled to. She said the camp was under review for sanitation checks, but everyone knew that was a lie she told to stay a little longer. Her visits were brief, 5, maybe 10 minutes, but those minutes cut through the monotony like sunlight through barbed wire. She brought medicine, yes, but also something rarer, warmth. She asked questions no one else dared to. Did you have a family? Do you still write? Simple, human questions that made Wilhelm remember he was more than a number. At first, he answered cautiously. Then, more freely, he told her about the students he had once taught, about his dream of becoming a history professor, about the day everything ended, the day he was conscripted and handed a rifle instead of a pen. And Margaret listened. She didn't judge. Sometimes she even smiled, though it was always tinged with something unsaid, guilt, maybe, or longing. One day, as she packed up her medical kit, Wilhelm asked quietly, "Why do you do this? You don't owe us anything." She hesitated, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. "Because I used to believe I hated all of you," she said, "and I don't want to live with that anymore." He never forgot those words. But kindness, in a place built on suspicion, is the most dangerous form of rebellion. Whispers began. Other nurses noticed how Margaret lingered too long by the infirmary window. A guard mentioned that Kraus always volunteered for the cleaning shifts near the medical hut. Small things, innocent things. But in wartime, innocence could look like guilt. Still, neither of them stopped. They exchanged short notes hidden in the folds of linen or slipped beneath a bowl of soup. One of them read simply, "The world needs forgiveness more than victory." That line would later appear in Wilhelm's unfinished letter, the one found decades later. As Christmas neared, the prisoners were allowed to sing carols. British guards joined in, awkwardly at first, then louder, their voices mixing with those they once fought. Margaret stood at the back of the hall, watching the faces behind the wire glow in candlelight. She caught Wilhelm's gaze for a moment, just a second too long, and someone noticed. After that night, the tone in the camp shifted. Guards became more watchful. The other nurses avoided her. She received a letter from her superior warning of inappropriate sympathy toward prisoners. But by then, it was too late. Margaret's humanity had crossed the line that rules couldn't contain. Wilhelm's gratitude had turned into something heavier, something both terrifying and beautiful. When she next visited, she said nothing. She just placed a small envelope on his table. Inside was a photograph of her family's farm before the war. A single line on the back read, "One day, there must be something after this." He wanted to answer her, to say that maybe, somehow, peace wasn't just for nations, it was for people too. But before he could, orders came down. His work group was to be transferred within a month. Margaret found out the same day, and for the first time since the war ended, she cried in public. The snow kept falling, covering the tracks between them. And yet, beneath that silence, both of them knew one truth the world wasn't ready to hear. An enemy had become human again. The first morning of January 1946 broke like glass. Ice clung to the wire fence. The watchtowers glistened pale under a bruised sky, and the wind carried the sound of boots crunching on frozen earth. Camp 115 felt less like a prison that day, and more like a world trapped between two wars, one already over and another still raging quietly. Inside men's hearts, rumors spread fast. A new transfer list had been posted. The names of those bound for the eastern zones, the Soviet-controlled territories. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew what it meant. Few who went east ever returned. Wilhelm Krause's name was on that list. When Margaret heard, she froze mid-step in the infirmary hallway, the paper trembling in her hand. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The world outside had started rebuilding. People were dancing again. Rationing was ending. And yet here, behind wire, one man's fate still hung in the cold. That night, she stayed late under the pretense of taking inventory. She waited until the guards made their rounds, then slipped quietly toward the outer fence where the floodlight didn't reach. She knew he'd come. He always did when the moon was this low. He was already there, his breath visible in the dark, his coat thin against the cold. Between them stood the fence, a single stretch of rusted wire that could end both their lives if crossed. She spoke first. "They're transferring you east." He nodded slowly. I heard. You can't go, she whispered. You won't survive there. I know. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then she pulled something from her coat, a small silver locket, the kind worn before the war, the kind soldiers carried photos in. She pressed it through the fence until it caught his palm. Inside, he saw a strand of hair and a single photograph, a field of poppies. When it's over, she said, voice breaking, promise me peace. Promise me you won't let them take that from you. He closed his fingers around the locket. I promise, he said. But what if peace doesn't want me? Her eyes filled, and for the first time, she reached through the wire, her glove brushing his hand. It was nothing a second of contact, but in that second, the whole war seemed to stop breathing. Then came the floodlight. Who's there? She jerked her hand back as the beam swept across the snow. A guard shouted, boots thundered. Wilhelm ducked, pressing the locket to his chest. She stepped away, eyes wide, mouthing words he couldn't hear. The world shrank to panic and footsteps. The next morning, Wilhelm's bunk was empty. No farewell, no transfer truck, no record. Just gone. And 2 weeks later, Margaret was gone too. The official report called it voluntary resignation. But those who worked with her whispered another story, that she'd been dismissed quietly, her name struck from the Red Cross registry. Years later, the camp's files revealed that several prisoners, including Wilhelm Krauss, were listed as missing during repatriation. Not dead, not released, just missing. No one ever saw him again. But a few months after Margaret's dismissal, a package arrived at her family's farm. No return address, no note. Inside was a blank envelope containing a folded scrap of paper. The words were faint, written in careful German script. You promised me peace. I'm still trying to find it. That was all. Margaret never spoke of it. She kept the locket in her drawer for the rest of her life. And when the historian Edward Hargreaves found the unfinished letter decades later, that same phrase appeared again, as if the words had waited for someone to listen. The snow that covered Camp 115 in 1946 melted long ago, but the promise buried beneath it, that fragile hope between enemies, never did. The rain had washed away the last traces of the old camp when Edward Hargreaves returned to Market Wait On in 1990. The fields stretched empty now, golden under a weak English sun. Cows grazed where barbed wire once stood. There was nothing left to see, and yet he could feel them. The men, the voices, the silence. He held the letter again, its paper now sealed in a plastic sleeve. Time had turned the ink to a soft gray, but the words still spoke. You promised me peace. They were as heavy as the day they'd been written. After months of research, he had finally found her name. Margaret Ellis, born 1918, died 1973. Never married. No children. Just a modest life recorded in parish books and a quiet obituary that read simply, she served. When Hargreaves visited her old cottage, it was as though time had stopped there too. Dust lay thick over every surface. Books stacked in neat piles, all about healing, faith, and forgiveness. On the mantelpiece, a single photograph, a group of POWs behind wire, their faces half smiling. And there, half hidden under the frame, was a small silver locket. Inside, a strand of chestnut hair and a faded image of poppies. The same locket Wilhelm Krauss had once held through the fence. Hargreaves felt the chill run through him. The story wasn't a myth. It was real. He looked again at Wilhelm's last page, unfinished, broken mid-sentence. He knew he shouldn't, but he couldn't stop himself from reading it aloud. They said a man cannot find peace when the world remembers him only as a soldier. But if this reaches you, Margaret, then I was something more. The rest was gone, eaten by time. The historian stared through the window at the rain, trying to imagine their final moments. Her walking away from the camp gates for the last time, him vanishing into the white silence of post-war Europe. Did he die in some nameless transport convoy? Did he escape and hide under a false name? Or did he simply disappear, carrying her promise like a secret prayer? The mystery haunted him. But what haunted him more was the question the letter raised. Not just about them, but about the world that came after. Because Britain had done something few nations had dared. They treated their prisoners not as monsters, but as men. The government's re-education initiative had quietly transformed thousands of captured Germans into contributors, farmers, craftsmen, even teachers. By 1948, over 25,000 former POWs chose to stay in Britain, marrying local women, working in the communities that once saw them as enemies. Their children grew up never knowing the fences their fathers once stood behind. It wasn't a grand political act. It was something quieter, human. It began with small gestures, a shared cigarette, a kind word, a nurse risking her career to save one man. Margaret and Wilhelm's story was just one thread, but it symbolized the entire tapestry, how forgiveness had rebuilt what bombs had destroyed. And yet, not everyone wanted that story told. When Hargreaves published his findings in the Yorkshire Historical Review, the response was immediate. Letters poured in, some praising the humanity, others condemning it. "We should not romanticize the enemy," one wrote. "They caused our suffering." But another letter stood out. It came anonymously, with no return address. Inside was only one line, typed neatly on old paper. Peace was promised, and it was kept. No name, no signature, just that. Hargreaves stared at it for a long time before realizing something. The typewriter ink matched the faint gray hue of Wilhelm's original letter. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe, after all those years, someone had finally delivered a reply. He placed both letters side by side in a museum case under soft light. One written in German cursive, one in English type. Two halves of a conversation that spanned nearly half a century. Visitors still stop there today, reading in silence, some with tears in their eyes. Because even if history forgot their voices, the paper didn't. And when the narrator's voice fades, we see the snow falling again over the empty field where Camp 115 once stood, quiet, endless, forgiving. They promised each other peace, the voice says. And maybe, in remembering them, we finally found it. The camera lingers on the empty field where Camp 115 once stood. The snow drifts in slow spirals, settling over the grass, over the forgotten foundations, over every place where barbed wire once divided men. The wind carries faint echoes, boots, laughter, a woman's voice calling a name that the years have almost erased. Then silence. Narrator, history isn't only written by those who won. Sometimes it's written by those who try to forgive. A pause. The screen fades to black, and a single image appears. The letter, framed under museum glass, the ink trembling slightly under the light. If this story reached you, the voice continues. Then the promise they made wasn't lost. Somewhere, between hate and mercy, they found peace. The music swells, violins, low drums, the distant hum of a world rebuilding. Then one final line. Some stories don't end, they echo. Fade out. If you want to see what happened next, how former prisoners rebuilt the very country that once imprisoned them, the next episode awaits. The prisoners who built Britain, the hidden army after World War II. Subscribe, and let the past speak one more time.